Okay, we gotta get started now, please. So this is the last session of the conference. We're going to hear from Talia Konkle. After she's done, though, please, everybody stay. I've got a few announcements to make before we close out the meeting. So our next speaker and last speaker is Talia Konkle, and her title is right up there.
Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me out here. It's such a pleasure to get to talk to this community and a pleasure to be back in Rovereto after 13 years. All right, I'm going to tell you about AI models and some of the, I think, genuine insights that I've gotten from studying these over the past 8 years or so that are relevant for cognitive neuroscience, cognitive science, and beyond. Start with the challenge of vision. We look out at the world, we see environments with objects and people acting and interacting, and those are just in our head. In fact, photons of light are hitting retinal cells and being transduced through into the cortical system and relayed along a cortical series of processing to arrive at some internal representation of what is out there, which is a really hard question. How is that working? What is this high-level representation of the world like? How do we even ask that question? And what are the pressures that are guiding the formation of the feature tuning and the processing happening along this ventral visual stream? Breakthroughs in machine learning and computer vision, I think, have really enabled us to put traction into these questions in new ways. Now, all of a sudden, we have models that can look at a grid of numbers and tell you there's a car in there. And the question we had when this came out is like, how are they seeing in the same way as humans or completely differently? And what can we learn about the mind and brain from them, if anything? And this really gets to, I think, a conceptual framework question that the field as a whole is grappling with. And we've sort of been seeing it. I think Jeff brought it up brilliantly, and Rodri was sort of talking about this, like, how do we want to think about how to use these models? How can we make safe inferences and not overclaim? And some of the early people, and some approaches going after how we want to think about these models, is to think of them as models of the neural system. By which I mean the link between the model and the brain is some sort of direct correspondence. This is the same as V1, that is like V4. And the goal under this kind of formulation is to find the best model. Some will predict better than others. Let's keep iterating until we find the best one. And the approach on this framework is to add biological detail and tests so we can find the one model. That's one framing. But I want to advocate that it's safer and useful and gives you different opportunities for inferences if we think of them in a completely different way. And that is as model organisms. This is a term coming from systems neuroscience where people will study monkeys or mice or flies or even octopi and think about how these simpler systems solve a problem of interest to try and gain more general insight into biological systems or information processing systems as a whole. And so I study AlexNets and ResNets in the same way that I think systems neuroscientists are studying different model organisms, which is that these are simpler information processing systems that do something interesting that I care about. They have some interesting behavior or some interesting property, and I can understand how this model does it in the hopes that I'll find some deeper common principle that will help me understand my more complex system. And on this framing, what you should do is science on the models, that it is valuable to understand how the models are working, articulate the ways they are and are not like human data, not because that makes them more or less good models, that would be this side, but because you can start to understand what kinds of mechanisms give rise to what kinds of competencies, And if you have a hypothesis for something that's missing, it makes you articulate, well, what mechanism do you think gives rise to that? And you have to figure it out and build it, and you can test it. And this is what makes them very powerful. And the key thing that is the insight that makes them most useful is to think of them as representation learners, where you get to control the visual experience, the architectural biases or scaffold through which information is going to flow and constraints on its plasticity, and goals or objectives that should shape the representations learned. And in doing so, in training these models, you end up operationalizing these hierarchical representational spaces where the algorithms are explicit, and you have full access to the weights and the connectomes. And so by doing this, we have now new traction into understanding what kinds of structure is learnable from what kinds of inputs given what kinds of constraints. So in part one, I'm going to go after a little bit this question of what's the goal of vision, which has been touched on by, a few talks in this whole couple days, I'd say. And I'm going to try and make a case for contrastive learning. So what's the goal of high-level vision? That is, what objectives shape the representation in these later stages of the ventral visual stream? And this is a big topic, and we could just go through these, but then I'm going to put them on a spectrum of more domain specialized, where that idea behind this is that there's just a lot of visual information coming in, and we don't want to just represent any image statistics. We want to represent the ones that are relevant for our tasks. And so what tasks are those? Now you have to articulate those, maybe face identification, object manipulation, navigation, and these are the kinds of things that should guide the kinds of features we learn. On another extreme, you might go, well, maybe there's some domain general learning algorithm let's just try and learn a representation that happens to be useful for all the tasks with a simple unifying objective so that this can make a more flexible calibrated system and be ready for things that may or may not anticipate a specialized need. But what could that learning algorithm be? And currently in the field, a prominent goal that we use is object categorization, which is somewhat specialized, except for it's 1,000 different labels on the thing. So it kind of sits in this, I think, in-between space. Like, learn a bunch of different categories is an interesting goal, but supervised, so can we get around this? And I think the question here is, do we really need to presuppose visual categories to learn a good representation? It would be really nice if we could learn a representation that can learn over rich input and tell apart like two exemplars, subtle visual differences that are from the same category. I would like to be able to represent those distinctly. Or social learning environments where there's not necessarily one category at all, but I still need to encode something relevant about this social interaction. Or things that have not been seen before, like new kinds of art. But what's an alternative representational goal besides categorization? And the insight that broke this field open came from a paper by Wu et al. In 2018 in computer vision. And they had the following insight. Instead of trying to learn a representation that distinguishes all kinds of categories from other categories, let's try and learn a representation that distinguishes every view from every other view. So they did this as like 1.2 million way supervised learning. What they found is that in this learned space, things from the same category tended to live in similar parts of the population code. So cheetahs clustered and fiddler crabs and cribs, such that you could easily read out category information just by looking at local parts of this population code. But they did this with 1.2 million way labels, but the insight was there. And shortly after that, a couple years after, a bunch of self-supervised learning algorithms came out that all have the same flavor. So here's the one that 𝗧𝗹𝗶 and I did called Instance Prototype Contrastive Learning. And it's a fully self-supervised, contrastive learning framework where you can learn useful visual representations with no labels. Here's how it works. You start with an image, i.e. the world, and you take little samples from it. Now, I think of these as like little proto-eye movements. And you run those through the deep neural network architecture and embed them in a lower dimensional latent space, say 128 dimensions. Now, to learn good structure in this space, we're going to do the following thing. We're going to update the weights so that the samples are similar to each other. They should land nearby in this space and be different from the things that you've seen in recent memory. In a way, this is a teaching signal of what it means to be the same and what it means to be different. And what we found is that this simple self-supervised contrastive learning scheme naturally has emergent category information in the local similarity structure. So this is just a visualization of that, which is, here's a bunch of images from the same category, colored by category, plotted in a two-dimensional space. You can kind of see. The other thing we found was the features learned in these self-supervised models were as predictive as the category-supervised models. So they're learning in a way, it could have been that they learned to do this, but the features are completely different than what we'd found. But in fact, they learn fairly similar features. And at the time, there was an explosion of self-supervised contrastive learning objectives. CIMeC, MoCo, Barlow twins, this was the insight that we needed to break open how you learn from rich data without labels. And since then, there's been new fMRI data sets, tons of model development coming out of AI, so we have much larger scale, both models and data. So we can ask, are these contrastive learning models still as good for responses to, now, in the case I had done before, it was isolated objects. What about natural images? That's the next data set available. So Colin went out and collected hundreds of models and tested them on tens of thousands of voxel responses to thousands of images. This is from the NSD data set. And conducted what we call opportunistic controlled rearing experiments. So we're not trying to look for the best model. We're trying to understand what kinds of inductive biases lead to more or less brain-like representations. So here's some of the results. So let's look at this set of models. These are models that all have the same visual diet, ImageNet. They have the same architecture, ResNet50, but they vary in the objective of how we should learn good structure. And we have some non-contrastive and contrastive self-supervised methods. And in general, the sort of contrastive models showed a better or higher aggregate brain predictivity than the non-contrastive ones. So that checks, that's nice. Here's some other models. These are trained on an even bigger image set. They have a different kind of architecture, which is a transformer. And this was an interesting set of models. They're trained on either self-supervised vision learning, vision language alignment, or a mixture of vision language alignment plus internal vision learning. So that's these, no difference. So if anything, adding language maybe dipped it a little down, but for the most part, this suggests that even when you could add in the language stuff, it's not giving you any more predictive. And the noise ceiling is quite high of these data. We're at 0.8, and there's this gap that just none of them are getting past, despite now many, many years of models getting better and better on tasks, but we've sort of hit a plateau here. All right. The other thing is, this is a taskonomy set. They are trained on 4.5 million indoor scenes. I have a ResNet50 architecture, so matched there. We're going to vary the goal and see what the emergent brain predictivity is. And they had a ton of different tasks. These are 2D point segmentation, depth inference, categorization, just all the tasks they could do at the time. And there is real variation in some tasks do better than others, and the ones that are the best are seen in object classification. But the other thing that really jumps out at you is these are all worse than those by quite a stretch. And the reason why we think that is probably data set diversity. These are trained on only indoor scenes. They don't get to see people, they don't get to see outdoor scenes, and so the kinds of features that they're learning aren't as predictive as brain. So we think that is sort of a hidden manipulation here, that the data set seems to be mattering. So why does contrastive learning work so well? How is it possible to bootstrap category information without putting category information in? And people are working on the theoretical understanding of what's going on. Wang and Isola have a really nice paper that sort of argue that when you map visual information into this sort of low-dimensional spherical sort of relates to the way you normalize it, that categories end up being in little local parts of the space, so it's super easy for readout. Localized readout can get you lots of categories. Zimmerman et al. Are finding that theoretical arguments that this kind of learning might be inverting the data generative process in a way that will be recovering the true underlying generative features of the data. So this is controversial, but it's interesting stuff happening. So there's important work to do here, like understanding why it's working so well, because everyone is surprised and yet it's working so well. Okay, so this idea of self-supervised contrastive learning being a way we think about the goal of the visual system has some powerful implications. And this is going to be a sort of data blitz section. I'm going to run through results a little bit fast, but I'm happy to talk about any afterwards. So the first is, what does this mean for how we should think of what that late stage representation is like? So this is a common sort of picture people have in their heads. There's the low level features like orientation, mid-level features that are maybe shapy, and then high-level features that are more abstract, categorical, semantic. Maybe they lack some visual detail, because how can you have a representation of something high-level if you are also encoding the details? That's sort of the thinking. That what we have up here is an object category code. But an alternative that this kind of modeling approach implies is that maybe what's going on is a reformatting of natural image space where different features make increasingly complex distinctions. And that's because by the late stage, we want to still be able to tell apart every view from every view. So we got to be able to have a representation up at this stage that can tell apart those two chocolate cakes or those two graduated cylinders. And those get maybe routed through the features to land here and land here, but still locally separable. And what that means is that the high-level stages can maintain incredible visual detail. And we can think of this as a high-fidelity perceptual interface, like a visual buffet of all the things we've seen, but in a useful organization, so you can read out different things and make different categories or new kinds of tasks, or do fast mapping by indexing into this and assuming some neighborhood. All of those things kind of can fall out really easily from this. Okay, I put this in for Jeff, which is like, what are those late-stage features like? We'd also like to have an understanding of, like, what are they? And maybe some combination of 60 billion parameters is not a satisfying answer. So we've got some work, and I mean, many people are working on this, but so here's an example that I really like. This is work by Chris Hamlin. This unit, we picked one, has an intermediate response to this image, Y. And he's got a feature accentuation technique that along that tuning axis, what would it take, how would I change the image to increase or decrease the firing? And you can see that if I wanted to decrease the firing of this, the eye changes to a furry eye, and to increase it, it sort of amplifies this more lizard eye. So we can think of what this unit is doing is really interesting. It's not just, say, detecting a lizard eye. It's actually discriminating between, like, lizard eyes and mammal eyes, right? Like, so these are these fine-grained discriminators that help route the image to the right part of space, right part of the latent space. And there's a whole field devoted to this, explainable AI and mechanistic interpretability, that are really trying to do the work of, like, how do we know what this means? Like, what is it doing? And that's moving along. So I think these are some of the pieces that suggest we will get answers that are interesting. Okay. Second implication is how important the role of experience is on the kinds of features that this model will learn. So with the contrastive objective, the nature of the tuning that's learned is inherently tied to the richness or the span of the visual diet. So if I train a contrastive learning model only on, like, one face where you vary the expressions of that face, then the feature tuning will reflect differences that pull apart, like this expression versus that one. If I train that same architecture but on a diet of only inanimate objects, I'll learn features that tell apart inanimate objects. If you have to learn all of that at the same time, people and expressions and objects, and multiple objects interacting, then you're going to need to learn features that can separate all of these kinds of views from every other kind of view. And it turns out that in that space of all the things we see, if you give a rich enough diet, certain signatures fall out that look familiar. So this is work by 𝗧𝗹𝗶𝗶. He took one of these models, and he ran the fMRI experiment localizers through them. So, and these are out of distribution. These are like literally the same exact things we use for finding FFA and PPA and BBA in brains. And he was able to find units that are category selective. They start out kind of weaker, and then they emerge, and then they're much stronger in later areas. So the same area might have some face and body and scene selective units as a part of that space. And then we check to see to what degree does that tuning axis correlate with or predict responses in brains. And so we took the face selective units and went, how well can these predict responses in the FFA to thousands of images? What about the body ones to the body? And the same model layer and these subsets of units are able to predict all of the category selective regions well up near the noise ceiling. We did a comparison where we trained a model only on faces to discriminate faces. It learns different kinds of features. That model doesn't predict FFA very well. So there's something about the nature of the tuning that puts the tuning in the context of all the things you see, not just within domain, but spanning domains, that's really important for capturing the structure of the responses across this. The other thing that falls out of these, so this 𝗧𝗹𝗶𝗶 has found that facing dyads seems to be like a primitive visual feature. So Danjanini, my graduate student at the time, followed up on this and went, well, can we use her localizer stimuli and her behavioral stimuli? And sure enough, in these models, we can actually see social dyad units that emerge naturally. So the same model, same general learning mechanism, rich visual diet, can recapitulate face selectivity, body selectivity, and also do things like find social diets. So this is pretty cool. I want to try Chaz's stimuli to go like, can it tell apart in versus on in any way? Like, is that readoutable? So these are, I think there's a lot of fun to go like, what does this get you and what doesn't it get you? Okay. Circuit routing. Now we can sort of do some model connectomics. Like, okay, there's 60 billion weights, but 60 million weights. That's not that many compared to the number of neurons in the brain. What structure is in there? So this is work by Chris Hamlin again, where he's going, okay, let's take a unit out here in the high-level stages. Do I really need all of the units beforehand to have this model do what it is? Can I drop any and still preserve its response over many, many images? And this is sort of related to how distributed versus sparse is the code. Like, if it's a fully distributed code, you can't prune it much. Like, all those things are mattering. Turns out you can trim basically up to 80% of the units in the prior layer and still preserve the function of these later stage units, which means that as the model is learning to discriminate all the things, there's these sparse computation paths that lead to any one unit. So especially up in the higher levels, the features that are involved in it matter for just part of the kinds of things you see, and they don't really contribute much to other kinds of things you see. And so that's that. So the network is learning these hierarchical routes. And an implication of that is there are dissociable functional effects if you lesion parts of the network. So Jacob then took those identified face selective units and lesioned them, and then looked to see what categories are impaired and which ones are spared. And we can see systematic patterns of deficits, and if you lesion the scene selective ones, you see different patterns of deficits, and those are dissociable. And so these kinds of things also fall out, not because we built the modules in, because it learned it from the data. So this is an implicit modularization that's coming from the learning process, and evidence for a sort of semi-sparse code. All right. Oops, out of animation error. Okay, the final thing, which is a whole line of work that we're really excited about, which is what it actually takes for this model to learn is multiple samples. It has to actively sample the world to learn good structure. So this makes contact with active sensing, the idea that you need to move your eyes and that you can, so all of a sudden now we finally have to go, okay, how do we want to put visual motor, like where you look affects what you're going to see, which is affect what you're going to learn. And so we have a line of work really exploring, like, okay, let's think about the foveal periphery and how you move your eyes, and it's really exploring contrastive learning models as active learners. Okay, so this is a new picture emerging, where if you had this view of the visual system hierarchy, what I think this work offers is another idea of how you might think about what's going on, which is to think of the visual system as a very domain general learning system. You can learn over any view by sampling it and trying to represent it distinctly in the space of all the things you've seen, and which arrives at this high-fidelity perceptual interface. It's about what things look like, but what things are is implicit in the local similarity structure of that space that's accessible with easy readout. So to me, this is this perceptual conceptual handoff where implicit in the features is what a thing is. And when you go to read that out, that's sort of giving it a name. It's entering it into some conceptual or some concept. And so this is sort of a map of our visual experience laid out along this late stage of the visual cortex. Okay. So this is new work that I've not presented before, so I'm excited to try. If the learning rule of the visual system is not about our goals, well, how do cognitive goals enter into the system? And we know that when we look out at the world, we're not just passive stimulus-driven receivers. We're active sensors. Our goals modulate and affect how we see and where we look. So what we really want is to be able to look for something, not just look at something. And we'd like this to be flexibly set for any goal, and ideally through language, like, hey, can you look for a cat? Sure, where are my keys? Great. Like, so you need it to be able to be accessible through some, other modality. And you don't want to be hallucinating everywhere, like I'm looking for keys and I see keys everywhere. You need to separate out what you see from what you're looking for, so there needs to be some protection there. I have a confession. When we started this project, these are not the goal. This is not what we went out to solve, but I think we ended up finding interesting solutions to this. In fact, when we started this project, the seed idea for it came from thinking about these circuits, these hierarchical circuits in the anatomy of a model, where the idea is if you're at some late stage where you may have pretty good evidence that, like, if this is going, you're probably more like a chocolate cake than a graduated cylinder. Well, why not feed back some of that to earlier stages to the degree that those participate more in cakes than graduated cylinders? Maybe it's not as selective, but the signal is there, and amplify one and suppress the other and help reroute something so it goes to the right part of the code. So that was the idea. And so, if we're going to channel content, then maybe we can have feedback to help in clutter to make things channel to the right part of the space. So we introduced these long-range feedback pathways into the model to intuitively try and help routing on a modulated pass. And later we realized this is actually useful for goal-based attention. Okay, so these are models with long-range modulatory feedback pathways, or LRMs. And I'm going to skip a lot of details, but try and hit the most important parts for the logic. But so let's take an AlexNet. We're going to add feedback projections. And which ones do you pick? There's many, many possible ways. Should all layers go to all layers? So we made a variation of models that have increasing number of feedback pathways, but some might go from the output to a middle intermediate layer, and from the intermediate layer to a first layer, kind of like IT to V4 and V4 to V1, but hand wavy. All right. How does this model work? You take an image, you run it through the network like normal, and that's the initial feed-forward pass. Now, activations from those are adjusted and fed back, waiting so that on the next pass, they combine with the feed-forward input with a little bit of multiplicative gain to help suppress some and amplify others, and then you get a modulated pass. Does that make sense of the flow? It's sort of like a two-pass system. There's not temporal dynamics every layer or anything. It's like, okay. So here's the key design, which is how do you know up at the top how features should modulate other features? So these are learnable features, channel-to-channel influences. So you take some source layer, say it has like 1,000 feature channels. Say this is the output layer, and those are the 1,000 different categories. And it's going to go to a destination layer that, say, has 384 different features. So we're going to put learnable weights, so you can learn how should this category modulate those weights. And the idea here is like, if you're a face output unit, you might amplify curvy and suppress boxy features on the next pass, and vice versa if you think the stimulus is more in the house part of the space. Is that making sense? I'm seeing some nods, I'm going with it. So disambiguate and reroute. And then the second thing is that the goal is still representation learning. So the goal is learn a good feed-forward pass and learn a good modulated pass and average those. So be good at both feed-forward vision and modulated vision. So there's nothing about attention in here. It's purely learn routes to scaffold representation learning. So what happens when you just run an image through on its first pass and its second pass? How well do they just categorize objects? So here's a comparison with the baseline architecture with no pathways, and here is the LRM model with the most feedback pathways we put in, which also is, in fact, even better on the first pass and even better on the modulated pass, which suggests that the feedback modulation is helping to establish even better feed-forward routing, which is kind of cool. How can the second pass actually be better on average? And we have squeezed out all the information in the first pass, what's going on? So we started to look into this. So here's just an example. This is an example of an image that was incorrectly classified as a fig and then later correctly classified as a ringlet moth. And if we look at the evidence on the output unit for whether it's a fig or a ringlet, the fig is relying mostly on the branches in the trees that makes it think it's fig, whereas the ringlet is very much going, nah, there's good evidence here that this is a ringlet moth. Competition at these stages goes back, feeds back, and when it goes through the second time, you can see that, the ringlet has won over, and it's a moth, and then that's really explained away a lot of this, and now you correctly get it as a fig. So this is some cool explaining away dynamics. We think that clutter ambiguity in the initial pass might be where this is really making the most benefit. Late features can help refine and suppress earlier features for better recognition. Okay, so this is where we then realized that wasn't enough for a NeurIPS paper, and we needed to think what else it could do, and we realized that you could actually use these fixed pathways for flexible goal-based attention. So the idea here is the output layer is like a control interface or a steering interface, and any category or any goal can be specified as a vector in this space. So to give an example, if you have this cluttered scene of a cute cat holding a key, then if your goal is to say, is there a key in this image, and that's your target, you can know where the key part of the space lives, preemptively activate that feedback so that on the feed-forward pass, this image is coded somewhere near the key space for readout. But if the goal is the cat, you put in a different vector. Through the same circuitry, the same image now gets processed more over here as a cat. So this is cool because it's a flexible use of this learned circuitry. We don't have to learn new circuits for every category we want to attend to. You just use the structure that's there. So does steering, this is idea, nice if it works. Does steering towards a category actually increase recognition accuracy like I diagrammed? To test this, we made the composite image recognition challenge. So we took a bunch of images from 10 different categories and made all these pairs where you put them up on top of each other. Models do very well on the individual images alone, but when you average them, it can't get either right. It's just like, I don't know what I'm seeing. Okay, so this is what we're going to use to see if steering can recover accuracy. And one question we had is, well, how should we steer? You can steer with one hot, which is like ones and zeros, which is like the objective. You can steer with an image representation. This exact image has this profile over my output space, like I'll steer with that exact vector. Or you could steer with the category prototype. On average, dogs look like this. They land here in the space. Let me steer towards the prototype. what we found is that the prototype steering worked by far the best, which was not at all what we expected. We thought like image, or we thought it would go in exactly the opposite direction. So that's interesting. So we see a dramatic improvement with this category prototype steering. Another test is when you steer towards something that's not there, don't hallucinate it. And in fact, the way we built the feedback, it can only modulate, it can't add, and so there's no hallucinations, which is a problem in some other models, and we don't have that here. And this result is actually really interesting from a cognitive science standpoint, because it means that, like, at least in this model, the exact visual details are actually not necessary for effective steering, which means you could do something like use language to get to the prototype to steer. So just to demonstrate that, we took a pre-trained language model and got the embedding in the language space for dog, and we trained a little diffusion process that can go from language to vision. So dog gets to the dog prototype in vision space, and cat gets to the, so you have this way to go from language to vision, one little link. And then that can steer the visual system, and now you can actually specify the goal in language and get modulation in like the early layers through this pathway. So it works as well as, or a little bit worse than category prototype, but it's just using prototype steering with a language pointer. And I think this is interesting. It opens up possibilities for like giving verbal task instructions to a visual model. And if we think about this as a like little model organism, that can like take some instruction and do some category prototype. It gives us a way to think about how language might influence early visual cortex. We know there's like really nice evidence. I like this paper by Lupion and Ward that showed that language, hearing dog, can like make a dog break through continuous flash suppression, which is thought to be in V1. And so like there's clearly this like high level to low level, and like how is that happening? And how can language know what V1 features should be? Anyway, this I think provides like a possible way that it could work. Does it work this way? We don't know, but at least it's like the beginning of a possible model. All right, there's also some promising mechanistic signatures here. So this is work by O'Craven et al. That we're looking at fMRI with these face-house hybrids, and the task is either attend face or attend house, and the image is always the same, and they look at what happens in FFA and PPA when your attention is towards one or the other. You see this nice modulation with the fixed input, and when we do the same thing with our face-identified neurons and house-identified neurons and put the same image there and steer toward those, we see the same kind of signatures, which I think fits with the idea that what this is doing is amplifying different routes. So that's promising. And I think this means there's a potential test bed here for actually trying to predict the neural consequences of top-down attention, like what categories, where should they affect, and can we, there's brain data on that. I was talking with Marius Pielin about this earlier, like what do we know about how this works, and can this model account for any of those signatures? And importantly, where does it not account for them? Like you need both, right? You want to understand what this model with its limited, simpler system can do and not do. So adding on to the story of the visual system, if we're thinking about what the current view of feedback circuitry, I think people know that there's a lot of it. Like it's well known that there's extensive feedback circuitry. There's different theories about what it's doing, some sort of explaining away, but there's not a lot of like thought about, well, how would you wire it up? What needs to be going to what, and how does flexible attention work over these circuits? And I think what this work adds is a way to think about feedback and attention in the context of representation learning rather than attention, that the same general learning objective of like learning the data distribution, and you learn feedback in the same way, that same goal, then gives an emergent sort of control interface that's easy to access through language that then uses internal visual machinery to know how to modulate. And that's sort of a nice sort of compartmentalization between the perceptual system and the cognitive system. If Chaz were here, I'd be pointing at him like, I do think that, if you want to put a modular view and separate perception and cognition, like here we are, like this is the bridge and this is perceptual and that is cognitive. Okay, in sum, I showed you self-supervised learning and introduced you to the idea of contrastive learning, showing you that you can get emergent categories without presupposing categories with brain predictive features, and highlighted that this may make you think differently about what that late stage representation is like, and the importance of visual experience, and I think teasing that where we can go with this is start to put it in a visual motor loop, which is like one step beyond vision into like how do we steer our own input. In part 2, I then talked about this goal-directed interface and this emergence of sort of a flexible way to modulate your visual system, showing some improved accuracy of the model, this sort of abstract way to access it, and promising potential for mechanistic insight. And all of this is in the context of this idea of a model organism framework. Like what I'm trying to build is this mini intelligent system that has sort of a constraint architecture. It doesn't have a memory system. It doesn't have a motor system. And it's like this, and that's on purpose because I want to sort of limit the set of things I'm testing. Already there's many, many choices. So even there it's still hard. But by doing so, I think that lets you study how mechanisms can give rise to like representational qualities and competencies. And what I've learned from doing this is that the data representation learning is a really powerful general learning motif that has a lot of promise for how we want to learn categories and how we want to steer our attention. Okay, so I put this in at the very end to think about, because I think it's touched on by many people here, which is like, what are the pressures guiding the formation of these features of how we represent our visual world? And I think these systems I think we're about to get to these sort of primitive cognitive architectures that have like a little visual system and a little cognitive system, a little motor system, like not the whole thing, but the key pieces to start to explore how these interact. And that will start to let us put traction on origin stories and flesh them out in a way that's more nuanced, which is required, because this is a pretty complex thing and there's a lot of things going on. And I think this makes you sort of be explicit about what your origin story is. And so my origin story, which I know not everyone here will agree with, but here it is anyway, which is that the perceptual system is fairly modular and can learn a good representation kind of on its own. Doesn't need a lot of external influences. And this is the cortex that is involved in seeing, like perception, seeing the now. Lesions here make you not see well rather than, right? Like it's a visual, it's like a visual. And from this, you might get to memory, like I need to figure out how the prototype's stored. I don't know, someone has to help me figure out how that works. We have this sort of flexible cognitive task, so you can read and you can map and configure any kind of task you want and then modulate, but I don't think of that as doing a lot of work doing the learning. I have a hard barrier there. And then this has come up quite a lot, which is what about connections to action systems like the infraparietal sulcus for tools and retrosplenial and hippocampal for navigation and superior temporal sulcus for socializing. And there's a real debate as to how much those connections are influencing the formation of features. I think, because I will be provocative, that they're only reading out and not influencing. But I recognize that you have to deal with the blind data, because the blind data, and we can have a conversation about that. But I'm just going to be provocative and say, I would say, nope, I think those read out and not influenced, but just why not take the stance? But where they might influence it is through other mechanisms that control where you look. Because where I look, if I look at faces and how I look at faces, feeds into the visual diet that affects the kind of tuning learned. So you can affect the tuning of the visual system in two ways, not just by providing a supervisory signal, but also providing a steering signal to how you look at the world in the first place. And so broadly, I think DNNs are just going to actually allow us to start to articulate and test these hypotheses, and it's an exciting time to be thinking about the origins and pressures guiding visual system development. With that, I'd like to thank my amazing team who do all the work. I just get to present about it. It's a great job. The funding, and thank you so much to you and for CHAOS in general. What an amazing conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Talia. It was an inspiring talk, as always. I have a special question about the last point you were making, and I think it's a super important point that I've been...
The origin one or the eye-looking one?
No, the eye
Where
movements
you look.
one, of course.
Yes.
Sorry,
Right.
I'm biased.
Yes, of
but
course.
I think what so far has been lacking, and I think you're going in that direction, is this kind of, you touched upon it earlier, the sampling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your active sampling of the world. And in the end, you said, like, it matters where you look. What parts of an image do you actually attend to? What is interesting to you?
Mm-hmm.
I think I would even go further and say, when you see your own kids, how they learned about the world, it's not just about where they moved their eyes. It's how they took objects in their hand and banged them against their brother or sister and see how that works.
I do understand
and
that
get
one.
feedback from that. Or even just, if you just stay in vision, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about how they take a fork into their hand and look at it from different angles and stuff like that. And I think you're touching upon this, but I was just going to ask, like, how do you see the field going further into this direction of this active sampling of information?
That's really good. Okay. The simplest hypothesis, simple from the point of building a model, simple, is that when I pick up a pointer or something and move it around, my haptic system is learning in its haptic coordinates. That's what pressure feels like, and that lives in somatosensory system. My visual system is going, I get all of this, I get all of this. And all you need to learn is a bridge between those. In the same way that for language mapping and division, all I needed to learn was how I get from my language representation to my visual. I just need to learn the bridge. That's the simplest one. So completely modular extreme. Modality-independent learning, where you have to learn a bridge, and you could learn the bridge by co-timing, or or you could completely wire up your system separately, and only later does the bridge form after there's enough structure to build a bridge. That's one. More is nope, the co-timing really matters, and that bridge is actually providing the supervisory signal to both systems. I think Rodri was talking a little bit about, so now, but in order to test that, you actually have to have a haptic model of the thing. There's work to do to flesh out that hypothesis in a model that we can test. So So even though I think those ideas are interesting, important, and probably true, it's easier to start with the really simple one where everything's modular and you just start to add on things just to see how far that gets you without the more complex thing. Again, model organism. That doesn't mean if it works, that's how the brain does. It just lets you understand what constraints are possible. And I think one of the things we've learned is there's many ways to get to similar representations. We didn't know that before, and now we know that with all these models. And so I do think there's work to do, but at least it's a start. Yeah, so that was a beginning of an answer, but yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. It was really beautiful. Really, really enjoyed it. The second part was really blew me away. Really loved it. I mean, the first part I just knew already was was great.
Been telling that story a while.
So it's one question, and I brought this up already in a previous question to someone else, but I wanted to ask it to you as well because for me it's a bit of a puzzle. I mean, I'm still amazed by how well self-supervision works, right? Because you would expect to need much more, right? But there we are. I mean, it's working extremely well. And to me, there's two possible explanations for why it could work so well. One is that, it has to learn the relations of different objects, right? But if you now have a network that is just trained on different views of the same thing, and then it's learning like certain visual features. One way is, of course, okay, it learns that like certain types of features are shared like between different images, but then it should be very shape-based, but for some reason it seems to also be explaining more than just shape, right? Another possibility is that on these images, there's actually multiple things at the same time that happen to have a relation, which is also like explaining the semantics. I mean, these are just, but maybe you have more explanations. Why does it work?
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna just tag the things I want to say. One, I want to comment how insane it works by highlighting a few other things that are really weird that still work. And then two, I want to talk about shape. Okay, so the first one is, like, it's getting RGB images. It's not even doing meaningful eye movements. Like, these are just random crops. Like, it could have been the case that to learn good structure, you also need to look at the right parts. Like, there are many things that could have had to be true to get some emergent structure. It's also doing, like, weird color, like, it is, like, at the low level, it is not like the retina or early visual system at all. So that it learns features that are reasonably good at predicting a lot of response variation in late stages at all. It's kind of amazing. I think a lot of the problems, like line drawings, like it doesn't have LGN to, the first stage should really like line drawing out the color. And like, so I think there's room, so it's a miracle that it works and that it learns and that it relates to brains. I think those are still why it's a deep insight that keeps on giving, because it's genuinely surprising. Why are they all texture-y? Okay, one thing is, I genuinely think the ventral stream does a lot of texture analysis. Like, we've got data that shows this, and like, I think there's sometimes a mismatch that happens. Like, behaviorally, we call this a cat, but I still see it as a cat with elephant texture. My visual system responsible for seeing shouldn't be confused by a cat with an elephant texture versus not. You'd like to be able to see those differences. I think this is the kind, like, and you need a model that represents texture to see that. One hypothesis we have for what might it take to get more shape information. I mean, there's a number of things. You could imagine you need a haptic supervisory signal. You could imagine you need the right mechanisms of, global processing. But one is a data answer. I always like those, which is right now these or possibilities. I don't know, these are all hypotheses. The model is learning over flat images and taking crops. It's living in a picture plane. But when you like turn your head like this, things in the foreground go behind each other, and so what if it learns over just give it a little bit more? Will the features that it learn up end up having a little more depth aware, shape information? So we're trying to build that now. It turns out the hard thing is getting a data set where you can do that. But we're making a lot of progress on this, so I think we're about to be able to train models that look by this way and testing whether they get a better shape representation. Could be wrong, but I think it's interesting. So, yeah.
Hi, just kind of following up on it. So this contrastive learning bit. So if I understand, so that would be the kind of learning that you would be doing before you can label things. So this would be like you'd be doing a lot of self-supervised learning pre-classifying things. Mm-hmm. And I understand how that could lead to better decoding capacity. So when you do your linear decoder, you can predict brain activations because you've separated things effectively. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering whether you get also good outcomes when you do RSA, where you're not, so it's kind of like, what you've done makes it good for decoding in this linear decoder, but it would be interesting to see when you average and not...
These are RSA.
Sorry?
This is RSA. So we do,
so the thing you showed was RSA, it wasn't linear prediction.
Yeah.
So by decoding...
when I use the word, there's two things going on here in your answer. There's a linking hypothesis. What are the commitments we want to make when we take a model and take a brain and try and link them? And then there's category decoding, like how should a later stage read out category information? And I can't tell whether you're asking about like a readout or a linking.
Yeah, I guess when I thought readout, I don't think RSA. I think that characterizes the similarity space, but I thought
right.
By readout is sort of like information that could be used, like a linear decoder could use it. So I guess I misunderstood when you...
No, you're right. I think that there's two things going on here, which is like, this happens to learn a really good space for linear readout. Actually, it's really good for sparse positive linear readout. So you don't have to synapse on every part of the population because they're separable, and this part doesn't depend on this. You can synapse on 10%, 5% of the right and get these categories, and the right ones and get those categories, which I really like about this because it doesn't make a commitment that to recognize categories we need to synapse, like a new neuron has to synapse on every single neuron of IT, which is sort of the commitment of a distributed code or a Haxby-like pattern or a linear readout with no constraints on it. But actually what we found, not only can you do linear readout, but also you can put even more constraints on the readout. Like they are sparse and positive only, so you can't like flip a negative and still do categorization. So that's for how a later layer, like a readout node or a cognitive module would learn about categories.
Okay.
The next question you ask is about when you're doing brain alignment, like the way we think about these units is, so you have a high dimensional space from like, here's the, let's say 10 units of a layer in a model, and let's say there's 10 neurons in this. So if there were one-to-one correspondence, the best commitment would be like, this neuron is that neuron is that, like that would be amazing, but there's not the same match. So we need some flexibility to know how you do matching. And I call these linking wars. There's currently a lot of debate on what's the right way to link these. The way that is the standard is the most flexible because when we had this, we were in a regime where nothing worked, so we were just like, anything, please, which is full-scale linear readout. Any linear combination of these for this unit, any linear combination for these for this unit. That's the norm, and people put ridge on it. But I think, and one of the things that I've been advocating for, is you should do sparse positive linking, and you should try and get as much coverage as possible. Like, be as close to one as possible. So you should cover the same population, and you can't flip a negative to make this tuning go. And people like 𝗞cie HS and Nancy Canwisher, and people who have generally thought of the information carrying signal as in the high magnitude response, they are advocating this is the right way to think of these systems. And in networks, I think it makes sense too, because the way that information goes from one layer to the next, there's a ReLU. So you can't, there's this ReLU space. But I would say that part, which is I call linking, to separate it from decoding. This is about behavioral capacities, and this is about mechanistic bridges. That there's linking wars, and I think we're making progress, but people very much disagree right now, and there are lots of debates on that. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. It was very nice, very compelling. I was wondering, you talk about these model organisms from systems neuroscience,
yeah.
And at least the animals all have in common that they're all shaped by at least similar evolutionary pressures. They all have similar chemical processes going on.
Yeah.
So it's reasonable if you find something in a mouse that the implementation could be similar to a human. And instead, these models are completely designed by us. Do you think that puts a limit or a ceiling on how effectively you can actually use them as a model organism when it comes to the implementation of these things?
I love that. It means you actually took seriously the model organism idea, which is great. And yeah, that's right. These ones are all biological systems, and this one's not. Does it count? But I think that's why they're very good tools for cognitive scientists, because they really make you cash out answers in terms of information processing and algorithms, this goes here and this is here, and this is going to connect, rather than in terms of trying to understand ion channels and gating, which is a lot of MCB is down at that level. And this is why I really like these models, because they make contact with both systems neuroscience and cognitive science. We can make these little mini cognitive architectures, but the units of computation, you can go, well, does this make sense with the brain? And I can hash it out and think about what the connectivity requirements are and sort of a neural architecture. So I find them to be a nice sweet spot, but you're not wrong. They aren't biological systems, so all the inferences you'd make about evolution don't apply. But information processing and constraints at that level, I think and if we think of our brains as information processing systems, I think we get more traction. I tried.
Okay, thank you.
That was great. I actually have a follow-up on the last question here.
Okay.
I was curious, and maybe following from Jeff's talk, I was curious the premise is that the better models are the ones that explain the most variance.
In the model as a model, in one way of thinking about it, yes.
And then if you kind of take seriously the model organism approach, should we give up on trying to explain the most variance? Because in a sense, like if you start off, I like the digital clock, cuckoo clock analogy. You say, well, it explains all of the variance in timekeeping. But if you define the digital clock as a model organism for the cuckoo clock, and you figured out how the digital clock worked, you'd just be further away from your goal of understanding how the cuckoo clock works. So, which seems that maybe variance explained is not the metric. Maybe it's understanding the system, that you're trying to study. And at some point, I think people have abandoned model organisms for this reason, because they realized, in fact, it wasn't a good model of the system they're trying to study. So if we take this seriously, does it lead us to a point where eventually we just abandon all these models as models of the brain?
That's a good question. Oh, shoot, I lost what I was going to say. Nope, I had a total. Your question was, it was variance explained, right? Okay. Variance explained over what conditions? Are we doing a natural image sample? Is that enough? I don't think so. Because it turns out the space of natural images, even though it's a tiny part of pixel space, is huge, and there's no possible way to sample it all. And out-of-distribution tests are really informative, more so than... So I think variance explained over line drawings, that becomes interesting. Or variance explained... So variance explained is not enough. It's underdetermined. Like, that's just... Given some conditions, how well are you capturing the signature of them? And when there's 2 bars, you can make an effect size. But when there's 3 bars, it becomes confusing. Like, what counts as good? And when there's 10 bars, but that's why we end up with correlation or prediction. Okay, so I think it matters what you're testing it on. And I genuinely agree that we can do controlled experiments over interesting image manipulations. So we're starting to explore that. Like, we've taken a bunch of models which in the set of natural images predict, this neuron and monkey IT equally well. But their tuning axes are not exactly the same. So if we use that feature accentuation that should parametrically up-ramp or down-ramp one, they actually make slightly different image sweeps. So now we're generating those, showing them to the monkey, re-recording in those, and now some models account for more variance than others. In other words, they're more controllable along this tuning axis. They look the same in the space of natural images, but in a local test, they're distinguishable. So it's still variance explained. It's still like, can I predict what this will do, but under settings that are important. So I think that's a subtle thing to not throw out the idea of variance explained, because it really matters, like, over what. The other thing is the goal, I think, should be to come up with links between mechanisms and competencies. This kind of mechanism allows this competency or this signature. Like, I want a stronger shape bias. So now that's a very specific probe. It may cash out in variance explained over these stimuli that vary in shape in an interesting way. But what mechanism do I need to have to be better at shape? Like, I gave you one idea, maybe if we learn over this view, we'll have better shape bias. So I think the kinds of answers we should look for in the model organism one is what kinds of thing gives rise to what kind of signatures, and probe experiments like these targeted ones that look for signatures over conditions are really valuable. And that's very different from the I'm good at all tasks and all the things and I can do everything with the best top benchmark accuracy, which I think is more I want one model to rule them all. I want answers. It matters that they're good enough. If you only looked at this, I think you need to be good enough. I don't think you want to be explaining 2% of noise. So they have to be good enough, but otherwise we should not look at that as the pure outcome measured end all. I'll stop talking now. Go. Did I answer your question all right? Okay. Hi.
Thanks for the great talk. I also really liked the second part, so about the goal-directed interface. And I was wondering if you tested stuff like composite goals, the classic take a king, take away the man, and then you end up at queen, and these kind of goals. So whether you can actually sum up
is there vector semantics in the vision space?
Yeah, do you get that emergent from the training?
I have never looked at that. That's interesting. I could look at that. I have done one thing that's a little bit related to that, which is, say you're trying to steer, and you've got like cats or keys, and you know it could either be cats or keys, and you're looking for keys. You could steer your cognitive system, look for keys, or you could steer your cognitive system to look for keys, not cats, which is vector subtraction. Take this prototype, subtract it from that prototype, and use that as my steering vector. In this model, it does not work. It doesn't work any better. In fact, it doesn't work as good as if you just give the target. That's interesting. Is that true in brains or behavior in any way? I don't know, but like, so we've started to look, thinking, I bet I know the optimal steering signal, and it wasn't in this case. But I haven't looked at whether there's meaningful things in the sort of vector semantics, or in the vector math of the space, and that would be really interesting to look at. All the models are available online. Please use them. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
I get confused very easily, so I'm going to ask first if I understood what the enterprise is all about, so that I can then have a follow-up question. So if I understood correctly, what he's saying is, look, the brain, the mind are just too complicated. Let's start with something we can understand, and we understand it because we built it, okay? So now I have a model, I've constructed all of these things, and I can study it, I can look at the various things, and then I can ask questions. To be able to perform at some level, in these models, I had to do these kinds of things. And so perhaps those are initial hypotheses we can entertain about how the human brain does it, okay? Is this a
Not
correct
exactly.
interpretation?
There's one key thing that matters, which is just because we built the models, it doesn't mean we understand them. Because these are not models that we built to explain a phenomenon. These are models where we put loose constraints and they learn. They're more like we found an animal and we want to see what it's doing, even though like we made them. But it's like you have to do science on the models the same way you have to do science on the brain to figure out how the models are working. You don't know it because you built it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but the objective is to do that, to understand that, which then forms the basis for understanding.
Yes, exactly. Like
does.
we found these little discriminative feature routers. Is that a good explanation of brain tuning?
So then why is it that already in the models that you're playing with, you don't include some distinctions we know about the human brain and about the human mind? That is, you are starting with, as it were, a tabula rasa and saying, let's build from that. Why that strategy? Why not, honestly, a real question, why not try and introduce some constraints that we already know about? Is that because you think that it would lead us astray?
That's a good question. It's a very valid question. I think it would be a mistake to think of this as tabula rasa because you have to put in, like, there's an architecture, right? You have to make a ton of decisions. So many decisions. When you're even like, how should we normalize across, like the number, so in a way, they are articulations of like how a system should learn, and every decision you make, like should the normalization happen over channels or space or both, is a commitment to some inductive bias, some way that information should flow. And the reason why I started here, well, one, that's where everyone did and they're working well, and that's already hard enough to step, but yeah. But I think there are a lot of inductive biases built into these already. We are testing them. We're maybe not testing the ones we want to test, but we're testing some.
So then my question is, it is possible that with this approach, we will not really get any deeper understanding. We don't know in advance. You're saying we still have to look inside whether they're going to generate useful ideas that we can then entertain to study the mind-brain.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And why do you have any hope that it is going to be successful, given that already the models that you're using do not include things we know about that distinguish the way in which we perceive? So a simple question. I beg your, sorry?
You're making the argument that there are things we know about the brain, and so this is not a good model because not everything we know about the brain is in there. And I'm trying to say, no, I'm going to make things that even aren't brain-like. See what they learn. Understand whether those things are in the brain are needed for the thing we think they do. Now again, it doesn't tell me that's what the brain is doing. It just lets you make sufficiency arguments and necessity. Like if you thought to learn categories, you need some supervisory signal. We now know you don't. if your theory about what the nativist pressures needed to be, they might update knowing that. But maybe they don't if that wasn't. So it's giving you like what kinds of things are learnable given what constraints, including ones that don't have all the things.
So,
in it.
yeah. So then the enterprise is that in 10 years we'll call you back.
Yes.
And then you'll say, we did all of
We
these
did
various
all the
things. And of all those things.
We've built a full-scale cognitive architecture that has all the things.
So this is the not nice part. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I can take
Why pursue that enterprise where there is no obvious way from the way these models work for us to decide which of those various elements are going to be the ones that are going to be important. And I guess it's because I don't understand these models. I get panicky. And those of you who do know what these models do may find comfort in some of the things.
Many people are panicked by these models. You have to stay calm and study on. Okay.
But I worry that it is great exercise for learning about models. I'm not so convinced a great exercise for learning about the mind. That's the question. Question, comment, call, what do you want?
Can I ask one back at you? Sorry? Do you think any modeling enterprise can tell you things about the mind and brain?
I hope so.
Can you give me an example of what a successful one would look like?
I'm not a modeler, as you know. But I guess would be to start with some idea about the things that I feel comfortable about. The field, I mean the field that we think we understand. Some of the distinctions we already believe to be important, and have those at least as initial constraints as a contrast, if you will, to the approach that you're taking, which is let's forget about all of that. Let me look at some computation, see what we can learn about these kinds of computational devices.
I mean, a lot of people are using them that way. Like, I'm going to add biological detail. I think dendrites are important. Like, what? And like that. Yeah, we have to stop. Is that what you're saying? No. Okay. So I think that's about.
Alfonso might be stopping.
What?
Oh, you meant to stop? Fine.
Oh.
No, I was trying to answer you.
Sorry, he's my old advisor. I'm used to the
So-
in there.
No, we have time.
I have to
We have time.
I have to say that Talia and I have been fighting 10 years.
Longer. I think. Let's not
12
count.
years. So we know all about this fighting. Yeah.
If I can, let me jump in because you touched on something that bothered me
Oh, good.
through the talk. So let me try to articulate it a little differently.
Okay.
And basically, all of part one
Yeah.
demonstrated that some really remarkable things can emerge from this model, including category distinctions. Using a model that you know is a lousy model for the visual system. Well, it's a lousy model because part two was all about the feedback. You can't turn the feedback off. The feedback is always going to be there, right? Mm-hmm. So we know that that's happening. Mm-hmm. And that's what I mean, that it's a demonstration of what can happen with a simple feed-forward model.
Exactly. Yeah.
That is a bad model for what the brain is doing, we think.
If you thought feedback connections are fundamental for solving this problem, what you learn from this is you don't need them. That's the kind of inference that's safe. Like, this is safe ground.
Yeah, I get that. I get that, except, like I said, in the brain, you can't turn them off. They're there.
You want to know the truth? The other seed, I didn't put this in.
I'd love the truth.
The reason why we started this project is actually because there's this science paper that came out that figured out how to use optogenetics to suppress feedback. It's brilliant. So they figured out how to suppress feedback from V4 to V1 by tagging V4, but then shining light on V1. So the only things that could be suppressed are feedback connections from V4 to V1. And so then they could measure what happens to the perceptual, what happens in V1 without this feedback. So cool. And so actually those experiments were exactly what we used to sort of design the 1,700 decisions for like, okay, how should this go? Like in terms of like, how do you want to add this information in? And so it was designed from an experiment that figured out how to turn feedback off so that we knew how to design it, which I think is fun, and that you mentioned that. I had to tell you, yeah. But I guess if you don't buy that it's useful to get simpler answers that we know are simpler than the human brain, then this is not the approach for you. Because those are the only answers that are safe currently, I think. But I tried to sketch out how you can start to use them to build a system where we're making a kind of cognitive architecture that has the pieces that everyone's talking about to try and understand how they balance and when they happen. I think that's the work to do. And I think we're learning surprising stuff en route, but maybe not everyone agrees. But I'm okay with that. Right? Yeah.
So may I finish my question then? May I finish my?
Yes,
So this was all to
quickly.
This was all to get to the real question I want to ask, and that is that there are at least a class of theories that assume that when we perceive something, when we understand something, that there are a whole bunch of levels of representations. You use the word representation, I think, to mean only the output. There are people who believe that there are representations before that final representation, and there are attempts to try and say what those things might look like. Okay?
Yeah.
These models have nothing to say about that, right? In the sense that they seem to be pretty continuous in terms of their characteristics and properties. So are we abandoning a whole bunch of results in the literature as we proceed to understand these models? Or is it already important to perhaps say that some of these models are, to begin with, very unlikely to be the ways in which the brain and mind work?
I love that question. Actually, I have a paper called Representation with a capital R, because chatting with you and chatting with Susan Carey about what it means to be a representation with a capital R, there's like some commitments about, it has to have its functional role and serve in this context, and and things can look representation-like, but not count as a representation for Susan. Like, when does a baby actually use this in a functional way? So there's a version of what it means to be a representation that I think cognitive scientists and developmental scientists use, which I label as representation with a capital R, which is a real commitment to its functional role in the cognitive system. Then there's the version that computer scientists use, where representation is an encoding format. It's just like natural image data could be in pixel space, it could be in Gabor space, it could be in a latent embedding space. Those are all representations, and there's just not a commitment about, it's just kind of like a looser, that's the lowercase one. I think the field, so I'm totally with you on this. I actually think this is a really important distinction, and as a field, we've gotten away with using the term representational similarity analysis, where what we have is this one, and what we're claiming is this one, and I don't think that follows. I think representation with a capital R, really you need to commit to the readout to behavior. How is this being used? What's its functional use? We see this came up when we could decode house and car information in FFA. There are huge debates. Why can we decode that other category information? It's not really used. It's not functional. It wouldn't count as a representation of cars with a capital R, because when I lesion it, I can still see cars, but when I lesion it, I can't see faces. So I think the capital R one, in order to know it, you have to relate it to function. In order to know that, you have to do causal experiments. You have to find the knob that shows that this thing does that in behavior. And I think the tools we have for that are just starting to be developed, and the field has gotten away with a lot when we can decode things from representation. So I agree with you.
Right, can I give an example?
Can we agree?
May I give
I mean, I could have tried to disagree for fun.
Is it on? So may I give an example Talia, there's someone here, his name is 𝗧𝗹𝗶, who studied an individual, you know that, okay? And he sort of, with his collaborators, sort of found that there's a level of representation in the course of recognizing an object or a shape of something that is called intermediate shape-centered representation. It turns out this idea is not new. I forget the names of the vision scientists who were already proposing this. And that's a stage of representation that is different from what we see in the world. What we see in the world is oriented shapes. We don't see a shape, we see something that's oriented in a particular way, and it has important roles. So I have to avoid it, I have to grasp it, so we have to have orientation information, but it seems to be computed in a separate and distinct way from the shape itself. These models generally recognize an object, no matter how you show it, they don't know how it's oriented. People who do robotics are very much concerned with orientation because the hand has to grasp the object that they have to move, okay? Now, so here's a proposal, a claim, it could be completely wrong, but the claim says before you recognize it as a car, you recognize it as a chair, you have computed a shape representation that is organized in terms of its own center of representation, okay? And not orientation. So these models then are not capturing perception the way humans do it, okay? And they already sort of ignore evidence, information, if you will, that says, look, your models, some of the levels in some way have to capture that information. That's what I mean by representation. I mean the intermediate representations to get to the final representation, capital R, okay? Yeah. So Italian and I fight about this all the time, okay?
So the modeling enterprise is, it's not putting those in. How do you think that works? Build it. How do you think it works? Yeah, we can get the signatures, and knowing the signatures is really important. And then the next step is, how does that get there? And this is what that's the modeling enterprise. Your model, you go, I think it could work this way. I think let's learn that. And so, I mean, I think the people that have really latched onto these early are the people whose phenomenon of interest were relatively well explained by what they could do so far, like basically categorize objects. But for the people like Stefan, is like, look, it doesn't do mine. Or for people who study coordinate frames, it's like, what are you talking about? I can't even ask my questions in this model. Top-down based attention. Couldn't do it. I tried to build one. Now you can ask questions where top-down based attention is enabled and we can manipulate. So I think, like, to me, all those things that are like, it doesn't do this, I'm like, great, we all have jobs. Like, there is just work to do because how does that work? We can build it and try and figure it out.
The last point.
Yeah.
Perhaps the next step of the organized should have a discussion that has someone presents the model, someone says, these are the kinds of evidence, minimal evidence that you have to think about when proposing these models, and have a discussion about how these models can actually accomplish these goals, or whether they can, without the way in which the structure simply are not structured.
Yeah, and I think that's useful. Like, that's where the model organism framework, that's not threatening. That's signposting. And so I see those and I go, great, that doesn't, let's think about how that can work. So I think that is not a problem with the approach, but a road to follow. And that's because I'm an optimist.
A perfect example of the kind of discussion that could only happen here at CAOS. Talia, thank you. All right, just a few housekeeping kinds of issues. First of all, I hope everybody agrees that this was a remarkably informative and educational and entertaining series of talks. So I'd like to give all 7 of our guest speakers a big round of applause. And of course, our students, not only the 5 that gave those wonderful talks, but everybody that participated with their posters to make this such a great meeting. So thanks to you guys. So I'll give you just a little bit of history. We started in 2007. The original organizing committee was 𝗧𝗹𝗶, Mel Goodale, myself, and Brad Mahone. The truth was that Alfonso, Mel, and I did nothing, ever. Brad, no, you did nothing. We showed up is what we did. So Brad did all the heavy lifting. When he left to go back to the States, Marius Peelin took over, and for many years this was Marius's meeting, doing all the work that was required, because this is not an easy thing to put on. And now we have Stefania and Moritz, who are responsible for this meeting. You guys need to stand up, take a bow. You know, if you guys were Americans, you would have stood up and taken a bow. Okay, what's left? So in terms of the last thing, in terms of putting this meeting on, there's been a bunch of students running around with the microphone, doing all this work. Where are they? I'm not sure, but they need a big hand of applause. Yeah. And the last point I'll make is when we started, the 30-minute discussion periods were always filled, but they were filled a lot by Alfonso and Mel and some of the speakers, and we would always plead for the back of the room to ask questions. I think we succeeded because there's been a tremendous amount of interaction with you guys who like to sit back there. So give yourselves a big round of applause.